If you want to live the American dream rather than just dream it, you should move to Denmark.
Hello everyone, welcome to Equals. I'm Grazielle.
And hello everyone, I'm Max.
And Max, what was that quote about?
Well, the quote is from Richard Wilkinson. We're interviewing him today, together with his long-term collaborator, Kate Pickett. And what he's saying there is that the American dream, if you think the classic American dream, if you just work hard enough, if you try hard enough, you can make it, you can get rich, is more likely to happen in an equal country than Denmark than it ever is to happen in an unequal country like the US. So if you want to live the American dream, you need to move to Denmark.
Wow, that's the huge power of the equal countries, right?
Exactly. And that's the theme of today's interview, really. Across so many different parts of our life, just how important equality is. And they've written a really famous book called The Spirit Level, many, many other books about this power of equality. So we're going to talk to Kate and Richard about that.
Great, looking forward to hear from them.
Let's do it.
Hello, Kate. Hello, Richard. It's so nice to have you here with us. And I heard from Max that reading your famous book, The Spirit Level, 10 years ago, was so enlightening for his work on inequality. And then I went to research about the book, about the authors, and I found out that you are both epidemiologists, and that called my attention. And now I'm curious about your background and how that influenced the content of the book.
Yeah, so both Richard and I are social epidemiologists, so we study the social determinants of health and health inequalities. He came into it from a background in economic history, and I came into it from a background in anthropology. So we converged from different directions to focus on those wider, broader determinants of health, like the economy and the social setting in which people live. So I think that's the background that gave us the rationale or the context of asking questions about income inequality. And what our work together has really shown is that inequality affects a very wide range of things, health and other issues, and that the differences between different societies are very large. And that's because everybody's affected by inequality in a society. The poor are affected the most, but everybody's affected. So I think our background gave us the framing for asking the kinds of questions which we then answered with our research on inequality in relation to health and social problems.
Well, let's dig into those a bit. So starting with health, which was kind of the original perspective you were coming from, what did you find out? What is the relationship between levels of equality and various different health outcomes?
Well, if you live in a more unequal society, whether that's an unequal rich country or a more unequal American state, you're more likely to suffer from quite a wide range of health problems. So in more unequal places, we see higher rates of infant mortality, lower levels of life expectancy, worse mental health, but we see chronic conditions as well, like obesity, asthma, diabetes, are more prevalent in more unequal societies. There were more excess deaths from COVID in more unequal places. Well-being's lower. There's more drug use and sort of problematic alcohol mortality. So a very wide range of effects. And that's because we think that the causal pathway there is that income inequality and relative poverty affect levels of chronic stress. So if you live in a more unequal society, it's a more stressful environment, and chronic stress affects pretty much every part of your physiology, your body, as well as your sort of thinking and emotions. So chronic stress is almost like premature aging. So it has that wide range of effects on the body. So what we're seeing here is a link from the wider social environment being more stressful for everybody, and that creating this worse population health.
Yes, because in your follow-up book, The Inner Level, which focused just on mental health and the impacts of inequality, that was really also really, really powerful. That this isn't just about what we would think of as kind of physical health problems. It's also about mental health too, isn't it?
Exactly. So the stress is felt in the body in sort of physiological ways, but also in the mind, the way we perceive things. There was a study by colleagues of ours from Ireland that showed that levels of anxiety about status are higher in more unequal places. And that's probably key for understanding why we see those higher rates of depression, higher rates of anxiety, and severe mental illness, and everybody being affected by those issues and not just the poor.
And what does that mean? Status anxiety? Maybe try and explain for us.
The way to understand it is to think of inequality as a social relationship. Uh, Differences in income and wealth put us in a sort of hierarchy, which is often seen as sort of the best at the top and the worst at the bottom. And what income inequality does is make class and status more important, more influential. It tightens its grip on us, if you like. Um, and as that becomes more important, we judge each other more by status and worry more about how others judge us. And so, the fear that you're seen as inferior or unattractive, boring, all those things, all those sort of negative judgments seem to be increased with inequality. And indeed, as Kate was talking about chronic stress, it looks as if to us, although there are worse causes of chronic stress, I mean, losing your home or your job, if you're looking at the population as a whole, we are all worried about how other people see and judge us, and worry about sort of self-presentation. You can, for instance, feel too worried about people's judgment, so you find parties and going out with friends and seeing people too stressful, and people in that situation sort of accepting an idea of their inferiority or whatever, become more socially isolated. So think of these kinds of worries as an important stressor, but also as affecting behavior in all sorts of ways.
At the book, you also look at a broader issue of what you call social cohesion. Issues like democracy, trust, crime, fear. And when I was looking at this, I kind of remembered a situation that I lived when I started working for an organization that required more travels abroad. And so I live in Brazil, I'm Brazilian, and I had to travel to Denmark. And I remember receiving an email and they said, so when you get to Denmark, all you have to do is take a train and then walk 15 minutes and get to the hostel. And I was like, my flight is going to arrive there at midnight. How am I supposed to walk 15 minutes on the street? For me, it was something impossible to leave that. But then when I got there and I started walking on the streets at midnight, I saw bikes everywhere and they weren't locked. So I really couldn't understand the place where I was. I didn't feel fear. It was so intense for me. So how do you bring this on your book and how do you see that?
I think that's an extremely important point you raise. Because Denmark and actually the Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, are much more equal, you feel, as you've described, almost immediately you go there walking about in the streets, you're much more relaxed. You don't have to be aware of who's on the street with you. And actually, what the data shows, when we look at statistics, on things like how much people feel they can trust others or levels of violence in different societies, you see that it goes closely with levels of inequality. So, more unequal societies, people don't trust each other. Community life is weak. There is more violence as measured by homicide rates, for instance. Um, and in a way, what it does is confirm the idea that I think people have intuited for centuries, that inequality is divisive and socially corrosive. Um, and actually, if you look at more equal countries, you see this good community life. Most people, something like 70, 80%, feel they can trust others. Um, Homicides very low. But as you look at more and more unequal societies, you see all that atrophies, all that goes away. You get increasing violence, people not trusting each other. But if you look at the most unequal societies in the world, places like Brazil sometimes and South Africa more than anywhere else, you see it's gone a whole stage further. People are actually there afraid to go out of their houses. They tell you, rather as you described, not to go out in the evening. If you look at studies of happiness or well-being or even of health, you find that some of the most important determinants of health and happiness are the quality of social relationships, how many friends you have, whether you're involved in community life, things like that, make a real difference. So, what inequality is doing is, in a way, undermining the most important aspects of the quality of life for all of us.
I was really interested to hear your story, Graziella, because we sort of had the opposite, the reverse experience visiting Mexico and visiting South Africa, of going to a much more unequal society and feeling that tension and being advised about not being out on the streets or not doing certain things unaccompanied, and it really only as we left those countries, the weight of that tension then lifting. And if we think about whole populations exposed to those different environments for all of their lives, then I think it's not surprising that we see these very profound impacts of inequality, that they create in each society a particular culture that is either more or less stressful.
There's an interesting study from two American economists which shows actually that we have to pay for this insecurity, that more unequal societies, a higher proportion of the labor force works in what they call guard labor, people working in security or prison staff, police officers, all those people who, in a sense, protect us from each other. That becomes an increasing proportion of the labor force in more unequal societies. And of course, it makes perfect sense in terms of what we've just been talking about.
Well, one of the things I also remember you saying about Denmark, Richard, some years back is about social mobility as well, because there is still that sense that maybe because unequal countries are somehow more cutthroat and people are more having to fight, that there's more mobility in those places. But your findings were the opposite, I think.
Yes, there's a very strong tendency for more unequal societies to have less social mobility. And actually, this is Kate's joke, not mine. She likes to say when speaking to American audiences that if you want to live the American dream rather than just dream it, you should move to Denmark, because, of course, the USA is much more unequal and there's much less social mobility. You have much less chance of moving up the social hierarchy than you do in a society like Denmark.
The Danish dream. I love that. Let me come back to some work. And this is really coming more up to date with the work that you've been doing, that I've been really following recently, on the kind of relationship between equality or greater levels of equality and environmental problems, or the lack of environmental problems, and particularly climate action. Can you say a bit how those two streams have come together for you?
Yes, there are several links between what we need to do for the environment and inequality. And the most obvious is simply because the footprint of the very rich, the environmental footprint, is so much bigger than it is for other people. But it's also that, given that it is so much bigger, to take green policies will often be opposed if people feel that nothing is being done about the inequality in terms of responsibility for the environmental crisis. So, for instance, when President Macron in France tried to uh, get people to use less fuel and proposed raising fuel taxes to do so, that was opposed by long-standing demonstrations all over France by the Gilets jaunes, who said the policy was unfair. And it's interesting the contrast with Britain in the Second World War, where I think it's clear that the government recognized that problem, that they recognized that if you want people to take part in the war effort, you must make them feel the burden is equally shared. And they implemented policies that made Britain a more equal country during the war. And we need to do that with climate change. But there are a number of other important links. That is that, of course, we try and emulate the consumption of the rich. We're very prone to status consumption, and there's now quite a lot of evidence showing that if you live in a more unequal society, you spend more on sort of signs of status, an upmarket car, clothes with the right designer labels. And if you want to control or reduce consumerism, as we need to move towards sustainability, you just have to reduce inequality. And that I see is now being argued not only by Oxfam, but also by Thomas Piketty, the French economist, and by the EU. There's a recognition that actually a precondition for sustainability is a dramatic reduction in inequality.
Can I just add something there? Because I think an issue that we're also starting to grapple with, perhaps, are the links between inequality and differences in governance. So there are links between greater economic inequality and things like air pollution and biodiversity. And I think to understand those, you need to think about who has power within any system of governance. And so who is able to block perhaps the wishes of the population to shift towards sustainability, who is protecting the interest of the powerful to prevent that sort of change, or who's got the power to hold land and have that not be biodiverse. So I think we're at the beginning of trying to understand all of the different links between inequality and the environment, and how inequality is a block to the changes we're going to have to make.
Yes, and one thing that calls also the attention is that most of your research has been based on data from, let's say, rich countries like the UK, the US, Europe. And is there any evidence that these findings that you see about the power of equality are they also true in the global south?
Well, the simple answer is yes. But first, I think it's worth saying why our analysis is confined to those rich, developed countries. Um, in part, it was less so now, but in part, it was to do with the availability of robust, comparable data from different countries. But that does improve all the time, but also because we knew that in those rich countries, there was no longer an association between economic development or GDP per capita, any measure sort of economic progress and health. That was just not present anymore. And so we wanted to sort of look at those countries where the benefits of economic growth for health had come to an end, and look at the impact of inequality there. Whereas we know that in poorer countries, they need economic growth as well as more equality for the health of their populations. But having said that, there are plenty of studies by other researchers looking at the impact of inequality in the global south or across the world or in particular regions. And those have focused very much on health and on crime. I would say those are the two areas where there's more work in the global south. And they show the same picture, that greater inequality is damaging in terms of population health and levels of crime. And in fact, there was a really interesting study of Latin American countries that showed that you only got a benefit to health of improved economic growth if you were not at the same time becoming more unequal. So that the two things need to be looked at together, economic growth and inequality in that context. But I think the take home message is that across the world, wherever you look, inequality is damaging to health, to well-being, to social cohesion.
I think we've all done a good job of putting inequality on the agenda. I think people, and it's just so obvious, people are angry about it. They're angry about the scale of inequality. But I'm increasingly thinking that we haven't done enough to build on the amazing start that you made to demonstrate the opposite of that, the kind of power of equality. Because certainly thinking as Oxfam, what we do every year is we put out our Davos report. It highlights, eye-catching figures about billionaires and the growth in economic inequality. And then we use that as an entry point to kind of dive into one or other issues that we think are deeply relevant to why that's happening and part of the solution. So, I mean, a classic example would be a whole paper on how do we increase taxation of the richest people. But where we haven't really done much is to make this case for almost like a necessary condition for any of those policies is a significant reduction in your Gini coefficient, or however you want to measure it. And I don't know, is it just me thinking that, or I just wanted to know what you two thought about that?
In a way, that's why we wrote the inner level after having written the spirit level. I think our impression was that people thought all the things we dealt with in the spirit level were all things that are sort of distant out there in society. You can say, okay, the murder rate is higher there than here, but you don't think of things like that as really affecting you personally. I think people have a view that they are really only affected by a small personal world, what happens to them, their close friends and family. And so what we were doing in the inner level was showing the importance of these status anxieties affecting people in all income groups. So we're more worried, as we were saying earlier, by how we're seen and judged in more unequal societies. And I think that is probably the major determinant when you're thinking of the population as a whole of our real quality of life.
I mean, I think first I want to say thank you to you at Oxfam for doing what you do to bring greater attention to the impact of inequality, because I think it has had a powerful impact on the way the problem is understood. And I think we're all on a journey here that has started with us perhaps describing the problem, the impact, that our work's contributed to that, but your work contributes to it all the time as well. Richard has often said he thinks of our work as being like putting a social microscope on the evidence. So biologists look at things through the microscope to look at the cause of things, and we as epidemiologists have a social microscope comparing different societies. Because I think you're right, Max, when you're in it, you don't necessarily see how different it is or what the possibilities are of a more equal society. So I think the work that we all do collectively to demonstrate that a different quality of life is more possible in a more equal place is really important. And although we've come some way with that, I think we're a long way from many national and international governments and institutions really taking that on board and grasping the fact that they need to tackle that inequality before they can really hope to achieve a sustainable economy, a healthy well-being economy for everybody, a greater quality of life and socially cohesive communities. That fundamentally they've got to do that inequality reduction to get those things. So I think this is a journey we're all on, and I hope we'll all continue to contribute to. But I think I have hope that we will see change, because I think the evidence base grows stronger and stronger, and that it will be incontrovertibly obvious to people that this is what they have to do in the end. I just hope that they will do it sooner rather than later.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah, no, I agree. I agree completely. Thanks, guys. That was amazing.
We appreciate the chance to do this.
Thank you so much.
So, Max, what was your favorite part of the interview?
Well, I think my favourite part, Grazielle, was your story of arriving in Denmark that night, and your first experience of a really equal country.
Yeah, that was so insane. I can, if I close my eyes, I can see the picture again in my mind, like in front of me, all those bikes, just laying there without anything holding them, locking them anywhere. So I just came out of the subway and saw thousands, I guess, of bikes there, and they weren't locked. So for me, it was, I couldn't understand how it was possible for people to not be afraid of losing their bikes. It was
Yeah,
when I saw that, yeah, it was when I realized it's safe for me to walk here. It was quite shocking, yeah.
we've done quite a lot of work with a Danish multimillionaire. He campaigns for taxing the rich, and at one point he went to Brazil to meet, I think, a billionaire, but a very, very rich Brazilian. I think in Sao Paulo or Rio, and he went to his house, and it was very similar. This Danish millionaire had never been to a developing country, never been to Brazil, and he told the story of going into this apartment block, a really flash apartment, and you can imagine. And he said the guy had amazing windows, floor to ceiling, with a great view. But he said that he had bars on the windows, and he'd never seen bars on windows before. So, and he said, this guy was richer than me. He had a beautiful apartment, but he was living in a cage. When I walk out of my door in Copenhagen, the only thing in front of my house is flowers. And I thought that was such an amazing, amazing image for, flowers or bars on your window. So I do think more equal societies are truly wonderful things.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Do you know what I really wish is that, well, living here in Brazil, one of the most unequal countries in the world, is that one day, and I hope this is possible, we are going to be less unequal and we are going to feel more safe. I have hope on that.
I think it's quite possible. I think that if you look at history, one of the great things about inequality is it's not permanent. I was astounded to discover that Sweden, for instance, well into the 20th century, was one of the most unequal countries in Europe. They even had a situation where rich people had two votes in the parliament because they were rich. And they went from that to being one of the most equal countries in the world. So I think it's quite possible. And I want to believe that Brazil one day will be just like Denmark and have flowers, not bars.
Me too. Flowers instead of bars.
Oh, yeah, that's a good image to finish with. Anyway, thanks everyone for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the interview with Kate and Richard. And tune in next time, and keep listening to Equals.
See you next time.
Thanks, everyone.